Deuteronomy chapter 7. In our last episode, if you listen to that one, you remember Papa John kind of got emotional, and it surprised me. But Nehemiah Gordon, a Hebrew scholar, Dr. Nehemiah Gordon, describing what he believes Christ did as part of his last breath. And we're going to study that because it's so powerful when we get to the New Testament. But he's saying that Christ, he's quite positive, spoke the actual divine name of his Father as part of this Shema, as part of the last words that you utter as a Jew. And yeah, you got to understand, Nehemiah Gordon doesn't accept Jesus Christ as his Messiah, although he does say he may very well be, and he's definitely this Jesus that I've discovered since COVID and reading the ancient manuscripts of the New Testament in Hebrew. This Jesus that I was always warned about from my rabbis growing up, the heretic, I can't find him in the New Testament. But he goes, I can't, on the other hand, I can't find the Greek Jesus that the Christians keep trying to get me to accept. He goes, when I read the New Testament and read his words, he's a Torah observant Jew, defending the law of God and abiding by it. And he goes, he could be like me, a Karaite Jew who believes in the Torah only, and it's different than the Orthodox Jews. But he reserves the right to not decide yet. He's waiting for certain prophecies to be fulfilled. But to even say that, I think is quite remarkable. Anyway, let's get on with chapter 7 of Deuteronomy. Let's try to figure out how can we get past the surface level of the scriptures, closer to the original language, history, and context. Now, Deuteronomy is part of the Torah reading, the annual reading of the Torah. This portion they call the Akiv. As a result is what that means. And this is where, in this chapter, Moses recounts events that happened in the desert, including the manna, the golden calf, Aaron's death. Moses describes the blessings God will bestow upon the Israelites if they follow God's law, and the punishments they will encounter if they disobey. And there's a beautiful rendition of Moses looking longingly at the promised land that he will not be allowed to enter, at least not in this lifetime. And that goes back to a few episodes ago. Why? Are you kidding me? Moses couldn't go in? No. And there's reasons for that. Verse 2, we're going to start with, and when Yehovah thy Elohim shall deliver them before thee, thou shalt smite them and utterly destroy them. Thou shalt make no covenant with them, nor show mercy unto them, neither shalt thou make marriages with them. Thy daughters thou shalt not give unto his sons, and nor his daughters shall thou take unto thy son. So this is the instructions God's giving through Moses before they enter the promised land. Don't get caught up in their culture, because they're being judged because of their wickedness. Now, Halverson says, now that sounds incredibly harsh by modern day standards or sensibilities. Well, it wasn't harsh by the ancient standard. In fact, they wouldn't have been surprised at all hearing that type of talk from the pulpit, so to speak. The norm would have been to go in and take the territory and utterly destroy them. But we definitely live in a pampered age, don't we? Now, Halverson ends by saying, there is no crossing of those lines, no mixing of those boundaries. You cannot marry outside the covenant, and here is why. Verse 4, for they will turn away thy son from following me. That's God speaking. That they may serve other gods, the lower, not capital G-O-D. So will the anger of the Lord, or Yehovah, be kindled against and destroy thee suddenly. You're not, Halverson says, You're not very far away from Egypt, and I'm worried that a glance in the wrong direction and you'll slip right back into your old ways. It's going to take a while to build enough momentum. The lifeguard will save the drowning victim instead of the drowning victim drowning the lifeguard. You've got to be careful with that. Good analogy there. Verse 5. But thus shall ye deal with them. Ye shall destroy their altars and break down their images and cut down their groves and burn their graven images with fire. The groves. What are the groves? If you don't know, I hope you'll learn in time. We won't go into that today. But they practice their paganism on hilltops with groves, um, and burned graven. Anyway, and he's saying, destroy all their altars, break them down. Kind of a important thing. God is very insistent. Continuing, for thou art a holy people unto Jehovah thy Elohim. At least I'm trying to make you that, as Halverson inserts. Back to the verse, Jehovah thy Elohim hath chosen thee to be a special people unto himself, above all people that are upon the face of the earth. Moses is reminding them, you're about to enter the promised land. Don't forget these things. Halverson adds, do you understand why you are to be different? To live differently, to stay separate from those that drag you down to a lower level of living. Verse 7, Halverson says in verse 7, he then clarifies this chosenness, this special people status. He says, Yehovah did not set his love upon you, nor choose you because you were more in number than any people, for ye were the fewest of all people. Then Jared says, that's a perfect example of the few becoming many, the weak becoming strong. You're getting there. We're starting to be like the sands and the stars. That's not why I chose you to start with, though. Interesting. He has an eye for the weak. Verse 8, and Yahovah loved you because he would keep the oath which he had sworn unto your fathers. Jared says, you weren't chosen because of what you were chosen because of what I am from God's perspective. I placed my love upon you. Abraham chose me, and as a result, I chose him. He chose me against the odds, and I'm choosing him against the odds too, and to make him into something better than he was, and that goes for all of Israel as well. Verse 9, now know therefore that Jehovah thy Elohim, he is Elohim, the faithful Elohim. Will we be, Halverson asked, and then the verse continues, which keepeth covenant will we, and mercy with them. Well, I'm having a hard time. Which keepeth covenant will we, and mercy with them. Well, we need that with them that love him and keep his commandments. And here's the point of this verse, to 1,000 generations. Sorry for the struggle there. Halverson says, we've got Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and then on down through the generations until we get to Moses and to a Joshua and a Caleb and a rising generation of Israelites ready to take the promised land. All their parents have passed away. These are the children that never knew Egypt. They're ready to take the promised land. We're not even close to the 1,000 generations by that point, but God's mercy, his love will linger. It will stay upon us if we'll just stay with him. So let me just interject. Papa John's going to add some insights here. I didn't write this down, so just listen. To 1,000 generations, what's that mean? He says, I will love him and keep those who keep his commandments. Mercy to them and love to 1,000 generations. Do you remember how often you hear in the scriptures that we'll be judged and the sins of the fathers will be held against us to the third and fourth generation? And I always thought that's wrong. What'd my dad do, his father do, and my great great grandfather do that I want to be held accountable for? That's just not right. I thought of that as a negative, not a positive. But look at what he's doing here. God's holding the negative against us only to 4 generations, but the positive for those who love him and keep his commandments, he will keep and remember that for 1,000 generations. What a promise. I'm claiming that one. I'm claiming it. That's why I'm sharing this with my children and my children's children and my future unknown great grandchildren and such, my current family, extended family, and friends. Guys, what a promise. Let's claim that because he's not judging us for 1,000 generations on the negative, but if we do what's right, those blessings will flow to the 1,000th generation. Wow, that's a new insight for Papa John within the last year. Scrolling down, we get to a big if. Wherefore it shall come to pass if. And I'm going to scroll down and we'll read it here with Jono Vandor, verse 12. Here we go. This is in the New King James Version. Then it shall come to pass, because you listen to these judgments and keep them and do them, that Jehovah your God will keep with you the covenant and the mercy which he swore to your fathers. And he will love you, he will bless you and multiply you. He will also bless the fruit of your womb and the fruit of your land, the grain and your new wine and your oil. Increase your cattle and the offspring of your flock. In the land which he swore to your fathers to give you, you shall be blessed above all people. There shall not be a male or female barren among you or among your livestock. How about that? Jono says. And I believe Jono raises goats in Australia. He's our messianic believer from down under. So when he says livestock, he's like, how about that? And back to the verse, and Yehovah will take away from you the sickness and will afflict you with none of the terrible diseases of Egypt, which you have known. Stopping there, Jonah says, now there, because let's stop. I want to ask Mr. Nehemiah Gordon, who has a degree in archaeology, right? Now, I want to know, or do you know the terrible diseases of Egypt? Do we know what they are? Nehemiah Gordon. Those were things that, I mean, back in the old days, even today, to some extent, we have pandemics that even as recently as 1917. So obviously, this was recorded before the COVID pandemic, which was, I think, what, 2020? So we're just 5 or 6 years after that. He goes, so in 1917, there was a worldwide pandemic that actually killed more than World War I, and it was the flu. Think about that. We've got the flu all the time. We get it, but this was a variant of the flu that literally killed tens of millions of people, and this type of thing can happen at any time. The way I understand this, he says, this doesn't operate necessarily on the individual level. He's saying if you collectively, as a people, are righteous, then this is the collective blessing that you're going to get. I think that's backed. I think what backs that up is if you look at the curse, it's clearly a collective curse. It's not necessarily just an individual level. So here, a comment on verse 12. The second word of the Torah portion in this word, and this in Hebrew, is akev, which means because. And what can we say about the word because? But this is actually a very unusual Hebrew word to express the concept of because. And it makes me wonder if he didn't choose this word on purpose. This is a word that appears only 15 times in the Hebrew Bible. And the word for because, whereas the other words for because appear, I didn't count them, but there's got to be thousands of words that were translated, maybe just hundreds, into this word in English because. But the word here that is translated as because was akev. Akev. It's actually from the root word as Jacob, which is from the root word of Yaakov, the Hebrew word for Jacob, or in Latin, that becomes James. Boy, he just knows too much, right? Then Nehemiah says, you can translate it literally as on the hills of. Akev means a hill. Akev, on the hills of. So because as the result of such and such, on the hills of such and such, this is what will happen. So on the hills of you listening to these judgments and keeping them, etc., this is what's going to happen. Akev, because on the hills of. So that's pretty cool, I think, Nehemiah says. And I agree. And it's just interesting. Papa John, I started this episode by talking about household salvation. And the concept originates, in my mind, with the Exodus as they're leaving Egypt. And now God's going to put the curse, the angel of death, upon the firstborn throughout the land. Man and beast are going to die. So what did they do? He said, if you'll paint the lintels of your house, the entranceway to your house with the blood of the lamb, the angel of death will pass your firstborn by, and you will live, and they will live. And this is a protection for the entire household, not just the firstborn. It's a powerful concept that within the restored gospel we focus on more than modern Christianity does. It's not just an individual salvation. We're talking about household salvation and exaltation. Powerful concept and hinted at here in Deuteronomy. Verse 16, and thou shalt consume all the people which Jehovah thy Elohim shall deliver thee. Thine eye shall not, or shall have no pity upon them, neither shalt thou serve their Elohims, for that will be a snare unto thee. Verse 17 and on, back to our LDS scholar, he says, if thou shalt say in thine heart, these nations are more than I, how can I dispossess them? Then he adds, maybe that's why they are tempted to enter marriage. Back to the verse, thou shalt not be afraid of them. God's call, Halverson says, back to the verse, but thou shalt well remember what Jehovah thy Elohim did unto Pharaoh and unto all Egypt. And then Jared Halverson says it's interesting that that's exactly what carries Nephi through his difficulties when he's up against Laban. And who's Nephi? Well, if you've never read the Book of Mormon, which is the record of God's dealings with the remnant that was scattered and landed in the Americas, Nephi is one of the prophets, and as a young man, he was the son of a prophet, Lehi. So Lehi and Nephi, he's having a challenge. Before they left Jerusalem, he's sent back to get certain records, and they're in the possession of one of the government officials of the military in Jerusalem. His name is Laban. So he is remembering what we're told to remember here. This is what gave him the faith, remembering what God had done to Pharaoh and in the eyes of Pharaoh and Egypt. So when he has these difficulties, when he's up against Laban, he says what he says to his brothers who were ready to throw in the towel and give up. This is too hard. We can't get these plates. They failed in several attempts. We can do this, Nephi says. How do I know? Because God delivered Israel from Pharaoh. And he records that in 1 Nephi 4, 1 through 3. And if God can deliver Moses from Pharaoh, he can definitely deliver us from Laban. We just got to trust in him. We're going to be different. We're not going to be fearful. We're going to be faithful. Thank you, Brother Halverson, for connecting those dots. Now, here's a correction in verse 19. It says, the great temptations which thine eyes saw, but you're going to find out with the help of our Hebrew scholar that it's not about temptations, it's about the trials. Again, think about the Exodus and everything they've been through in their wilderness wanderings. So the great trials which thine eyes saw, and the signs, and the wonders, and the mighty hand, and the stretched out arm, whereby Jehovah thy Elohim brought thee out, so shall Jehovah thy Elohim do unto all the people of whom thou art afraid. Wow. So the great trials which you saw, not the temptations. How about that? Jonah Vandor appreciates that insight. Nehemiah is going to explain right here. Well, two things. One is about the hornets. So where was the hornets at? Oh, right here, verse 20. Where, moreover, Jehovah thy Elohim shall send, and we've crossed out the hornet and replaced it with fear/terror among them until they that are left and hide themselves from thee be destroyed. So he says that's not correct. Let's see what he says. So the meaning of the word in Hebrew here is not clear. It's not so clear. Actually, some Hebrew experts say that it means terror or fear, meaning the gripping fear that makes the enemy run away and lose the will to fight. And the reason they say that is because it's also mentioned in Exodus 23:28. In the previous verse before, he says, I will send the Zara'eh, the Zara'eh, which they're translating as hornet. He says, I will send my terror before you. So it's very possible that Tara'eh is just another word for terror or fear, and not because the hornet, like, what's the hornet? How is the hornet going to drive away the enemies? Then it's actually fulfilled. Well, that actually is fulfilled. That particular statement is fulfilled in Joshua 24:12, which we'll get to soon in the Old Testament, right? And Nehemiah says, and there it says, and I sent them before the Tara'eh, and it drove them out before you, the two kings of the Amorites, not with the sword and not with the bow. So was it the hornet like what? Was it killer bees or something? It doesn't really make a lot of sense, but that word is used in a future episode of God's deliverance. Interesting. Jonah says, "Yes, I think, okay, so there's a wasp or something, maybe or maybe not." So it's not necessarily a literal hornet. Okay. Nehemiah says, "Well, no, I don't think it's a hornet at all. I think they didn't know what it meant, and so they cooked up this translation. But apparently, from the context in Exodus 28, it might also mean fear. It means some kind of anxiety that would overtake the people." Then another thing in verse 16, maybe you can get to that, Keith, and read the opening word for verse 16 in your translation. So Keith is reading from the New International Version, the NIV. He says, "You must destroy all the people of the Lord," in all caps, "your God gives over to you." So Nehemiah says, okay, so you have destroyed. That's really interesting because what it literally says in Hebrew, and this is a great example of the Torah. There's a principle that the Torah speaks the language of men, meaning it speaks in the language that was used at the time. And it literally says, "And you will eat all the nations that Jehovah your God gives you. Your eyes shall not pity them." So literally, you shall eat. Now, what does it mean? Eat. I mean, if you're to take this literally and not understand the idiom, the usage of Hebrew, you would think, okay, we're commanded to be cannibals, which is probably why the translators completely just covered it over. I mean, they hid that because they were afraid somebody someday would read this and not understand the context. Somebody in some far off land might hear this and not understand what the Hebrew culture is and say, "Oh, God commanded the Hebrews to be cannibals and they're barbaric people." And of course, that's not what it means. It means to consume, meaning it's a figure of speech, it's an idiom. You're going to devour. You're going to devour those people, but not literally. It just means destroy. Chew them up. You're going to chew them up and spit them out, right? So this is just an example of slang. Essentially, God is speaking, or Moses is speaking in the slang of that time. There's several examples of that. Okay, that is very helpful, right? Because otherwise, we're going to stare at those words like Jonah was and say, "Send hornets," or "fear." But how many times do we see them run? In ancient Israel and modern times when their enemies just give up and run. Powerful. He's going to cause fear. What's the word he used there? Anxiety will overtake the people. I think we have, I think we got past the surface level of reading the scriptures. We're past the ink on the page. We're getting closer to the original history, language, and context. Thank you so much, Nehemiah. Verse 21, "And thou shalt be affrighted at them, for Jehovah thy Elohim is among you, a mighty Elohim and terrible." Wow. Jared Halverson, back to our LDS scholar, verse 22, "Jehovah thy Elohim will put out those nations before thee." But notice this phrase, "by little and little. Thou mayest not consume them at once, lest the beasts of the field increase upon you." So that's interesting. So the wildlife would take over the land if it was left desolate. So God even has that in mind. Papa John interjecting with that comment. Back to Halverson. "This is going to be a gradual victory, not a momentary conquest. This is line upon line. This is little by little." Now, Jono Vandor from Australia adds verse 22, reading it from the New King James, "Jehovah your God will drive out those nations before you little by little. You will be unable to destroy them at once, lest the beasts of the field become too numerous for you." Now, Keith, he's asking our Methodist minister, "Do you think it seems to me as if Jehovah is saying, you've got some responsibility here. There are certain things that I expect from you." I mean, it's not as if God couldn't subdue them animals or even keep them down to a number, but obviously well, is there a responsibility that he's expecting? And our Methodist minister, Keith Johnson, says, "I kind of go to the big picture and I say, okay, I'm going to arm you for battle, but you're not going to fight. I'm going to put you in this situation, but there's a process that needs to take place before the land is fully prepared. There's a natural process that goes on here. And while that process is going on, you're going to build up, you're going to be strengthening, you're going to you're being strengthened and you're getting more confident. You were able to handle this and now you're going to move to that. You're able to handle this city, now you're going to move to that city." So there's really something about it that just seems to kind of, if I can say, the process of the journey itself, they're walking along. So I think that I understand what he's communicating there. Jonah responds, "Yes, there's a process and there's a maturing." and there's an expectation of them to be able to develop certain skills within a period of time. And it's not as if, Keith, in my tradition, where we're so often made to believe that God will just do it for us as if we had no part to play. But when I read this, like, I think there's obviously a maturing and a skill developing, and He knows what we can handle, and He brings us through it because we have a part to play. He expects things from us as well. So there's a process, and that's Jono finds interesting. And I'm grateful to see Jono realizing that it's not just about faith, it involves effort. And I love the Hebrew language for its being an active language and not just an intellectual debate of accepting. And when I believe, it's more than just intellectual. I have faith. No, it's active faith. It's in the doing. And as we're doing, we're becoming. It's like an athlete getting better and better. Nehemiah says, wait, can we go back to verse 21? So it says in Hebrew, you will not fear them, for Yehovah your God is in your midst. And then it says, El Gadol Val Ra. So how does yours translate that? Keith Johnson says, mine says, a great and awesome number. That's the NIV. Jono says in the New King James, the great and awesome God. So instead of a great, it's the great. Slight, almost the same. Nehemiah says, so he's awesome, dude, right? Is that what it means? Like, no, really, what does it mean, awesome? The Hebrew word is norah, norah. Comes from the word yara, no, yare, which means to fear. And it's awesome in a very literal sense that God is something that it inspires awe, and awe really means fear. I think that's interesting. He's great and he's awesome, and that's the exact phrase appears in the next chapter in verse 15 where he says, "Who leads you in the great and awesome desert." Now, how does yours translate that in the next chapter? It's the word consistent. So Nehemiah says, no, Jono says, that's very interesting. No, it's not consistent. I've got great and terrible. Keith, what do you have? Keith says, let's see. He led you through the vast and dreadful desert. Nehemiah says, that's the exact word. And what does terrible mean? They mean terrifying. That's really what they meant, apparently. And the translators said dreadful. But now imagine if they were to translate that the way applying to God, the great and terrible God, or the great and dreadful God. The point is, in Hebrew, it's the exact same word, and it means awe-inspiring, something that causes you to feel awe, to feel fear, in a sense of respect. That's how they felt about the desert. This was a massive desert where you look at the desert and it inspires awe, dread, and terror. Like, oh my gosh, there's no water here. There's snakes and there's scorpions. And then back to the scriptures. And Yehovah is such a great God. He's so massive, it inspires awe. That's more accurate to the Hebrew. Thank you, Nehemiah. Verse 23, Jonah Vandor again. But Yehovah, your God, will deliver them over to you, and will inflict defeat upon them until they are destroyed. And he will deliver the kings into your hand, and you will destroy their name from under heaven. No one shall be able to stand against you until you have destroyed them. Verse 24 is what we just read, and then 25. Back to our LDS scholar, Jared Howerson. The graven images of their Elohims shall ye burn with fire. Still, that's separation, Howerson says. Thou shalt not desire the silver or gold that is on them, nor take it unto thee. So these idols of their gods, you don't want to even salvage the gold or the silver, lest thou be snared therein, for it is an abomination to Yehovah thy Elohim. Look up the word snare, Jared Halverson says, in the Old Testament, and almost every time it's talking about surrounding influences. Those are traps to steer clear of. This is a surface level thing, and if you were to look past it and you'd be so unimpressed with the gods of the world, the late 19th century in America is referred to by historians as the Gilded Age. We have the Rockefellers and the Carnegies and others. These robber barons became incredibly wealthy. We have a rise of the middle class, a separation from the lower class. It's golden. Oh no. And Mark Twain says, I believe it, I believe is the okay. He says Mark Twain, Howerson says, I believe he coined the phrase, "It's not golden, it's just gilded. This is surface level shine, and that's not even worth wanting." That's what he's getting at near the end of verse or chapter 7 here. Don't even desire it, not just to take it, don't even want it. Verse 25 and 6, back to Jonah of Andor. He says, reading, "Nor shall ye bring an abomination into your house." So these idols, these false idols, "lest ye be doomed to destruction like it. You shall utterly detest it and utterly abhor it, for it is a cursed thing." Now, to me, Jono says to Keith, after going to Sunday school all my life and then going to two Christian schools and brought up in the church, and when I was about 30 years old, I actually started to get serious about my faith, and I actually began to apply the things that they said in the Torah in my life. And I came across that verse, and I looked around my house, and I thought, oh my goodness, how far do I take this? How do I understand it? And in my zeal, boy, did I have a house cleaning. We went through the house and we got rid of everything that you thought was anything that was not in accordance with his word. And there was a lot to go that went out in the trash. But how far do we take this? How do we understand this verse? So our Methodist minister says, well, one thing I think is really important issue that you're bringing up is, I know there are a lot of people that, if I can use the word carefully, that go through the swing, and the swing is far to the right, and then they swing far to the left, and they're like these polar opposites, and swing far to the right, and everything that looks like, smells like, thinks like, or acts like, I think it's detestable. And then they swing to the far left and say, oh no, nothing really matters. And the question then becomes, what is abominable? What is detestable? And what are these things that we're talking about? And then Keith says, and then to ask the question, do those things apply to, for example, my friend Reggie White, who's passed on? And we had an episode previously that talked about the Minister of Defense. You'll find that in the title of that episode of Papa John's. And Reggie White was one of my favorite football players years ago, and he was a personal friend to Keith Johnson, our Methodist minister here. So Reggie White, before he passed on, and he says, I do miss him. I'm sure Nehemiah misses him as well. But one of the things that Reggie struggled with was that when he read a verse and his zeal was so great and so amazing, I mean, he approached his new faith like he did football. I mean, he was going to, I'm going to knock that offensive lineman off. And as soon as he'd learned something like in scripture, there was the application. And sometimes the application would take place without the information. And then he told me several times he'd come back and say, oh man, I overreacted on that, and I could have kept that. So, for example, he reads something like this, and he had a room where he had some of his great awards. Uh, he had won Defensive Player of the Year and sorts of things, trophies and such. And he looked at all that and says, this means this is detestable image. I've got to throw it away. And so one time he took all his stuff, and he went out and threw it out. And his sons and his daughter and his wife went out later. And he said he didn't understand, and they went out thankfully and got it back. And the point is that just that, in his attempt to really want to respond, sometimes it would be an over response, and then he'd say later, okay, I see what this actually means. So that would be the issue here. What was the thing that Jonah threw out, and so he's turning it back on Jonah. So Jonah, what would be the thing that you relate to that was detestable in your life, things that were abominable, uh, and to you, that when you compared it to the abominable to the people of Israel and what they dealt with? And Jonah says, amen. So let me just pick an example. What about an ornamental Buddha in the garden? Wow, now that comes out of nowhere. Nehemiah says, now, to me, the issue is, it's not something, is it something that is an object of worship, even if you don't worship it? I think that Buddha very clearly is whoever made it, and what he had in mind is that this was an idol, that it would be revered, and so that's an idol. Now, if it's something that's totally ornamental, I think we're talking about this before. Like, does that mean your children can't have toys or little dolls? I don't think that's the point of what this is talking about when it says graven images. The point is this an object of worship? Even if you don't worship it, if it's an object of worship, then you shouldn't have it. That's how I look at it. So I wouldn't feel comfortable, Nehemiah says, with a Buddha in my house. And I would agree with that. Interesting. Thank you again. Short episode this time, but food for thought. Think about these things. God has given us the code of holiness. These are books. Leviticus, Deuteronomy, Christianity overlooks these books for the most part, and the Old Testament in general. But in Leviticus, and in fact, the whole Torah, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, which is the Torah, this is God's holiness code. I hope we take it more seriously, think about things, and don't just go through life with surface level understanding. We need to think a little deeper than just our natural selves. Oh, I'm hungry. What do I want to eat? And that type of thing. I love you guys. Thanks for joining Papa John in another with this episode of Papa John Scripture Notes. Let's do this again soon, and I'll talk to you guys then.